The combine died on a Tuesday, not slowly, not with warning, not with the particular cough and rattle that machinery makes when it is trying to tell you something before it gives up entirely. It just stopped. One moment it was running, moving through the field the way it had moved through 1,000 fields before, and the next moment there was nothing. Silence where there had been engine. Stillness where there had been motion. 400 acres of standing soybeans in Iroquois County, Illinois, and the machine that was supposed to harvest them sitting dead in the middle of them like a monument to everything that was about to go wrong. The date was September 4th, 1979. Vern Calloway climbed down from the cab. He was 61 years old. His hands were the color of saddle leather and had been for as long as anyone could remember. His back had been asking questions he could not answer since Korea, which was 1951, which was 28 years of questions he had learned to live with the way you learn to live with weather. He stood in the dirt beside the dead machine and looked at it, not the way a man looks at something broken and panicked, the way a man looks at something he used to trust and is now reconsidering. He stood there for a while. Then he picked up his hat, which had come off when he climbed down, and put it back on his head and turned around and began walking. 2 miles back to the equipment shed. No phone call, no flag waved from the field, no neighbor summoned with a shout across the fence line. Just a 61-year-old man walking through soybean fields in the late afternoon of a September Tuesday with 11 days, maybe 12 if the weather held, and he had reason to believe it would not, before the cold front coming down from Wisconsin swallowed every dollar he still had standing in the ground. He walked. Let me tell you about Iroquois County, Illinois, because you cannot understand what was at stake without understanding the ground it stood on. The land there is flat in a way that has to be seen to be believed flat in a way that stops being a geographical description and becomes something closer to a philosophical condition. You stand in the middle of it, and the horizon sits all the way around you, 360 degrees of it, and the sky above feels not like sky, but like pressure, like the entire atmosphere is leaning down on you with the specific weight of everything that has ever grown up out of that earth and everything that ever will. In September, when the crops are standing full and the air has that particular smell of ripe grain and diesel exhaust and cut bean stalks, the place looks like something a painter would attempt and fail to get right. The light is wrong for a painting. It is too honest. In 1979, Iroquois County had just over 30,000 people and roughly 740,000 acres of farmland. It was and remains one of the most productive agricultural counties in the United States. Corn and soybeans came out of that ground the way water comes out of a good well, steadily, abundantly, without fanfare. The farmers there did not brag. They did not need to. The land did the talking. The town of Watseka sat at the center of it all. A county seat with a grain elevator that rose above the rooftops the way a cathedral rises above a medieval village, which is to say it was the tallest thing around and everyone organized their lives in relation to it. There was a hardware store that smelled of linseed oil and rubber. There was a diner on the corner of Walnut and Third where the coffee was mediocre and had been mediocre for 30 years and would remain mediocre for 30 more, and where the gossip was exceptional and freely dispensed to anyone who sat at the counter long enough. This was farm country in the last full decade before everything changed, before interest rates climbed to 20%, before land values cratered, before the foreclosure auctions became a weekly ritual that neighbors attended in silence, unable to look each other in the eye, because there, but for the grace of whatever you believed in, went any one of them. The agricultural crisis of the 1980s was still a rumor in September of 1979, a coldness at the edge of things that most people in Iroquois County were not yet able to name. But it was coming, and Vern Calloway was walking back to his equipment shed with a dead combine behind him and 11 days of harvest weather in front of him, and no particular plan for how to resolve the distance between those two facts. He had grown up on this land. His father had farmed it before him, 240 acres in those days, and his father's father had broken the sod on a portion of it in the years after the First War. Vern had come back from Korea in 1951 with a Purple Heart and a shrapnel scar on his left calf, and one clear intention, which was to take over those 240 acres and make something of them. He had done that. Through careful expansion and two fortunate land purchases in the early 1960s, when the timing was right and the money could be scraped together, he had grown the operation to 680 acres by the time the story begins. He was not a wealthy man. He was a solvent man, which in farming is a different and considerably rarer thing. Solvency in agriculture in 1979 meant you paid your debts, you maintained your equipment, you kept a reserve against bad years, and you did not extend yourself so far that one catastrophic season could unravel everything you had built. Vern Callaway had managed all of that through 3 decades of farming, and the discipline it required was visible in everything he touched. His equipment shed held 11 John Deere machines, 4 tractors, 2 combines, both 6600 models, 2 planters, a cultivator, a grain cart, a field cultivator, all of them green and yellow, the colors of an American farming tradition, so deep it felt like geography rather than branding. He had maintained those machines with the obsessive precision of a man who understood that in farming, the difference between a machine that works and a machine that does not work is the difference between a harvest and a catastrophe. He kept a spiral notebook on the shelf above the workbench in the equipment shed. In it, written in his own handwriting, was the complete maintenance history of every machine he owned. Oil change dates, belt replacements, bearing inspections, hydraulic fluid intervals. The notebook went back 15 years. His neighbors used to joke that Vern's equipment never broke because it was too afraid to. It was the kind of joke that contains a genuine observation. He had a wife named Opal who had kept the farm's books for 31 years and who could tell you within a few dollars what the operation had made or lost in any season going back to 1951. He had a son named Mitch who was 26 years old and had been farming alongside him for 4 years, and who had his father's hands and his mother's patience and would need both. He had a dog named President who was too old to herd and too proud to stop trying. And he had, until this Tuesday afternoon in September, complete and unwavering trust in the green machines that had moved through his fields for 30 years. That trust was now standing beside a dead combine in the middle of 400 acres of soybeans that needed to be in a grain bin before the weather turned. Now let me tell you about the 3 weeks before the combine died, because what happened on September 4th was not an accident. It was a conclusion. It was the last sentence of a paragraph that had been writing itself for 2 years, and to understand the sentence, you have to read the paragraph from the beginning. In August of 1979, 3 weeks before the combine died, Vern Callaway had driven his pickup truck down Route 24 to Seidel Farm Equipment, which was the John Deere dealership west of Watseka that served Iroquois County and most of Ford County as well. He went there for parts, specific parts for the 6600 combines parts that had been on his maintenance list for the end-of-season service he did every fall. Frank Seidel owned the dealership. He had inherited it from his father in 1968 and had built it, he would tell you himself, with an emphasis that made clear he considered his own success to be a form of argument rather than simply a fact. In 1979, he was 44 years old. He wore pressed Wrangler jeans and a bolo tie to the dealership every day, which in Iroquois County in 1979 was the equivalent of a 3-piece suit. He drove a new 3/4-ton Silverado with the dealership logo on the door. His handshake was practiced firm enough to signal confidence and short enough to signal that he had somewhere more important to be. He was not a stupid man. He knew equipment, He understood financing. He had built genuine relationships with genuine farmers over 11 years, and those relationships meant something real. But Frank Seidel had also developed over those 11 years of running a successful dealership in a county that needed what he sold, a particular quality that success sometimes produces in men who have never been seriously humbled, a certainty that he knew better, better than the farmers what they needed, better than the manufacturers what they should build, and certainly better than some older farmer from east of town who had been running the same equipment since before Frank Seidel was old enough to shave. When Vern walked in that August morning with his parts list, Frank was in his office with the door open. He leaned back in his chair when Vern came in the way a man leans back when he wants to communicate ease and authority at the same time. He looked at the parts list. He told Vern that several of the items were not in stock and that the wait time on them was running 6 to 10 weeks. 6 to 10 weeks for parts on a combine in August, with harvest 8 weeks away. Vern stood at the counter and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he needed those parts before harvest. Frank said he understood that and that he would put in the order. Then Frank said something that Vern Calloway remembered with complete precision for the rest of his life. He said, "Vern, you are farming with antiques. When you are ready to step into the 1970s, you give me a call." He smiled when he said it. That was the thing about Frank Seidel's condescension. It always came with a smile, as if the cruelty was a courtesy, as if the dismissal was a favor. Vern took his parts list and left. This was not the first time. This was the third time in 2 years that Vern had come to Frank Seidel with parts needs for his 6,600 combines and been told the parts were unavailable or back ordered or coming on a timeline that did not match the timeline of harvest. The John Deere 6600 was a model the company had discontinued. Parts were becoming difficult to source. The dealership had less and less incentive to stock them. Vern had understood this was happening. He had been watching it happen for 2 years. He had been doing what he always did when something needed attention, which was pay attention to it and wait to understand it fully before deciding what to do. The combine dying in the field on September 4th was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. It was the ground telling him in the plainest language available what he had already begun to suspect. He walked the 2 miles back to his equipment shed. He put the tools away. He washed his hands at the sink in the corner of the shed, the way he washed his hands at the end of every working day, methodically, without hurry. He went into the house and told Opal the combine was down. Opal asked if it was fixable. He said he did not know yet. She said all right and went back to the books she was working on. The following morning, Vern Calloway drove into Watseka. He did not go to the dealership. He did not go to the equipment supply house. He went to the diner on the corner of Walnut and 3rd, and he sat down at the counter and he ordered coffee, which was bad, which it always was. And he sat with it for approximately 40 minutes looking at something that nobody else in the diner could see. Agnes Pruitt, who worked at the Iroquois County Public Library and who came to the diner most mornings before her shift, was sitting 2 stools down from him. She told the story of that morning for the rest of her life, which was how she said it, and what she described was not a man in distress or a man making a dramatic decision. What she described was a man thinking, very carefully and very quietly, thinking in the way that some men think with their whole bodies, with a stillness that is not absence, but presence, concentration turned inward. He drank the bad coffee. He sat for 40 minutes, then he left $1 on the counter and walked out. Agnes watched him cross the street through the diner window. She saw where he went. She was surprised. Vern Calloway had been in the library perhaps twice in 20 years, both times to look something up in an almanac. He went through the front door and straight to the reference desk and asked Agnes, who had followed him there because it was time for her shift for trade publications. He asked for anything she had on farm equipment manufacturers. He asked specifically for information on parts availability and dealer network infrastructure. Agnes Pruitt had worked at that library since 1962. She knew the reading habits of most of Iroquois County by memory, the way a good librarian knows such things. She found him what she had, which was not much, but was something. Agricultural trade journals, some manufacturer documentation, a few industry newsletters. Vern sat down at the reading table near the window, and he did not move for 3 hours. Agnes told the story of those 3 hours for the rest of her life. She said she passed by the table half a dozen times during the afternoon, and each time Vern was reading, not skimming, not browsing, but reading with the focused, deliberate attention of a man who is looking for something specific and knows he will recognize it when he finds it. She said there was something in his posture that she had never seen in someone at the reading table before, a quality of decision-making that she did not know how to name at the time and only understood in retrospect. She had been watching a man figure out the rest of his farming life. She did not know that then. She found out later the way everyone in Iroquois County found out later, and she understood then what she had seen. What Vern Calloway found in those 3 hours at the library reading table was not simple, and it was not obvious. And it was not the kind of thing that most farmers in Iroquois County in 1979 were thinking about, which was precisely why it mattered. John Deere in the late 1970s was in the middle of a major strategic shift. The company was moving aggressively upmarket. They were building bigger machines, more complex machines, more expensive machines, and they were doing something else at the same time that was less visible and less discussed. They were quietly restructuring their parts and dealer support networks to focus on that new high-end equipment. Older models, the workhorses that had served American farmers through the 1960s and 1970s, were being deprioritized. Parts were being allowed to go out of stock. Dealer contracts were being renegotiated in ways that reduced dealers' incentive to stock replacement inventory for legacy machines. This was, from a business perspective, defensible, perhaps even smart. John Deere was positioning for the future. But the future is cold comfort when your combine is dead in a field with 11 days of harvest weather ahead of it. What Vern also found was this. Massey Ferguson, the British-Canadian manufacturer, was in a different situation entirely. They had been losing American market share steadily since the early 1970s, and they knew it. In response, they had made a strategic decision that was almost the mirror image of John Deere's. They were aggressively building their American dealer network. They were dramatically expanding their parts inventory infrastructure. They were offering terms to dealers and farmers that John Deere was not matching. Their parts availability program for current models included a 48-hour guarantee, not 6 to 10 weeks. 48 hours. Vern left the library at 4:30 in the afternoon. He drove home. He ate supper with Opal. He told her he was thinking about something. Opal, who had been married to this man for 31 years and understood the weight of that particular sentence, said, "How much is it going to cost?" And Vern said he did not know yet. And Opal said, "All right then." And that was all either of them said about it that evening. The following Thursday was the Iroquois County Farm Bureau meeting at the VFW Hall on Grant Street. About 80 farmers showed up, which was a good turnout for September when everyone had harvest on the mind. The agenda was yield reports, chemical pricing, and a presentation from the Extension Office on soil compaction. Standard business. The kind of meeting that happens in county seats across the Midwest every month, and which most attendees would not remember a week later. Frank Seidel was there. He was always there. He worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who had been working this particular room for 11 years and considered it, if not his, then at least friendly territory. Bolo tie. Silverado keys in his jacket pocket. The handshake dispensed at intervals firm enough to signal confidence, short enough to signal importance. Vern Calloway arrived late. He took a seat near the back of the room and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. He listened to the yield reports. He listened to the chemical pricing discussion. He sat with the particular stillness that Agnes Pruitt had noticed at the library, reading table, the stillness of a man with more information than the room, and no particular hurry to reveal it. Then during the open discussion period, he stood up. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who had spoken carefully his entire life and had therefore earned the attention that louder men had to compete for. He said, "I want to ask the room something." He asked, "How many of you have had trouble getting parts for your older John Deere equipment in the last 2 years?" Silence. Then slowly hands went up. 12, 15, 20. He asked, "How many of you have been told by your dealer that parts are unavailable or that wait times are 6 to 10 weeks in the middle of harvest season?" More hands. 22, 25. He asked, "How many of you have looked at what Massey Ferguson is doing with their parts network and their dealer support program?" Dead silence. Frank Seidel, who had been standing near the coffee table at the side of the room, set down his cup. The sound of it was small in the quiet of the hall. Frank said, "Vern," and there was the smile in it, the same smile that had been there in the dealership 3 weeks earlier. "With all due respect, you are talking about a Canadian company. You are talking about tractors that could not pull a sled in a wet field." He looked around the room for the laugh. He got a few uncomfortable ones, the kind that come from men who are not sure whether to agree with the person speaking or the person with the smile. Vern looked at Frank for a moment. He did not smile back. He did not argue. He did not make the case he had been building for 3 hours in the public library and 3 weeks of thinking before that. He had asked his questions. The hands had gone up. The room knew what it knew. He said, "Okay," and sat down. People went home and thought they had forgotten about it or told themselves they had, which is not quite the same thing. But the hands that had gone up did not come back down in the minds of the men who had raised them. The questions Vern Calloway had asked at a Farm Bureau meeting in a VFW hall in Watska, Illinois in September of 1979 continued to do their work in the quiet of equipment sheds and kitchen tables and pickup trucks driving home from town in the dark. Some questions do not need to be answered in the moment to be answered. Now let me tell you about the machine Vern Calloway was driving when none of this had happened yet, because understanding what he gave up is the only way to understand what it cost him to give it up. The John Deere 6600 was not a glamorous machine. It was not the biggest combine on the market in 1979, and it was not the most technologically advanced. What it was in the hands of a man who knew it was reliable. Vern had run his two 6600s through 12 harvest seasons. He knew their sounds. He knew the pitch of the cylinder at full load and the slightly different pitch when the grain was tough and wet and the machine was working harder than it liked to. He knew which adjustments to make in which conditions. He knew where they were prone to wear and what that wear sounded like before it became a problem. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in his hands and his ears and the particular quality of attention that comes from 12 years of running the same machines through every kind of harvest condition that the Illinois weather could produce. You do not acquire that knowledge quickly, and you do not transfer it to a different machine easily. It is the kind of knowledge that is built slowly and that once built becomes invisible because it has become instinct. Green paint and yellow trim, the colors of 30 years of mornings, the colors of his father's equipment before him and his equipment after, and the unbroken line of American farm practice that those colors represented. When you have farmed in those colors your whole life, they stop being colors and become something closer to identity. The way the house you grew up in stops being a structure and becomes the shape of your own interior life. Vern understood this about himself. He was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He did not say these things aloud, and he did not reach for them when he was trying to make a decision. But he was honest with himself about what he valued, which is rarer than sentimentality and harder to walk away from. He had 11 machines, 30 years of habit and loyalty and knowledge, all of it painted green and yellow, all of it maintained in that spiral notebook on the shelf above the workbench, all of it alive in his hands and his body in the specific wordless way that a farmer carries his equipment. He was standing at the edge of a decision that would require him to trade every single piece of it. He did not know that yet fully, but he had been standing at the library reading table 3 hours. And the thing about reading carefully is that you begin to know where the words are going before they arrive. He drove home from the Farm Bureau meeting in the dark. The fields on either side of Route 24 were dark, two standing grain that could not be seen but could be felt as a kind of weight on either side of the road, all those acres of soybeans and corn waiting for the machines that would bring them in. The cold front from Wisconsin was still 12 days away, maybe 11 now. The equipment shed light was on when he pulled into the yard. It was always on. Opal kept it on for him when he came home late, which was more nights than not in September. He stopped the truck in the gravel drive and sat in it for a moment, looking at the light through the shed door. Then he went inside. He did not go to bed. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a pencil, and he began to write down questions, not answers, not yet, but questions. And beside each question, he wrote the name of a person he needed to call. The list was not long, but it was specific, which was how Vern Calloway approached everything that mattered. Outside, the Illinois night sat over the dark fields, and the standing soybeans did not care about dealer contracts or parts, availability programs, or the strategic direction of agricultural equipment manufacturers. They were ripe, and they were waiting, and they would not wait forever. 11 days, maybe. The first phone call Vern Calloway made was to Manitoba. He made it from the kitchen, standing at the wall phone beside the refrigerator, the yellow notepad on the counter in front of him, the pencil in his right hand. It was early morning, not yet 6, the kind of hour that farmers keep because the land does not observe the schedules that other people find reasonable. Outside, the Illinois darkness was beginning to loosen at the edges, the flat eastern horizon showing the first gray suggestion of a day that would be clear and cold and shortening by another 3 minutes from the day before. Curtis Calloway picked up on the fourth ring. Curtis was Vern's cousin, though the word cousin does not fully describe what they were to each other, which was two men from the same family who had gone in different directions geographically, but had remained across 30 years and 1,000 miles of distance, genuinely close in the way that people are close when they share not just blood, but a way of thinking. Curtis had farmed in Manitoba since 1961. He ran just under 900 acres of wheat and canola, and in the years when the weather cooperated, soybeans. And he had been running Massey Ferguson equipment since the beginning, because in Manitoba in 1961, Massey Ferguson was what you ran the way in Illinois. In 1961, you ran John Deere. It was not a choice so much as a geography. Vern told him what had happened. The combine dying in the field, the part situation with the 6600, what he had found in the library, what he was thinking about. Curtis listened without interrupting, which was something Vern appreciated about him. When Vern finished, Curtis was quiet for a moment, and Vern could hear the Manitoba morning on the other end of the line, a dog somewhere, the particular quality of silence that exists on a farm before the day's work begins. Then Curtis said something that Vern wrote down on the yellow notepad in his careful, economical handwriting. He wrote it down not because he was likely to forget it, but because writing something down is a way of committing to it, of saying to yourself that this is real and this matters and you intend to carry it forward. What Curtis said was this: the MF760 is the best machine I have ever run for beans. Not the biggest, not the fastest, but in a wet year in down beans, in the kind of conditions that break other machines, it finishes. That is what I can tell you. It finishes. Vern wrote the words. He looked at them. Then he said, "What about parts?" And Curtis said, "I have never waited more than 2 days. Not once in 18 years. And Vern said, "Thank you." And they talked for a few more minutes about other things, about family, about the weather coming down from the north, about how Curtis's youngest was doing in school. And then Vern said goodbye and hung up the phone. He stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the yellow notepad. He had 3 more names on his list. He made those calls over the following 2 days to dealers in Kankakee and Pontiac and Champaign, all of them Massey Ferguson operations, all of them in Illinois, all of them willing to talk to a farmer from Iroquois County who had specific questions about parts availability and dealer support programs, and what a transition from another manufacturer would look like, practically speaking. The answers he got were consistent: 48-hour parts availability on current models, dealer support programs with terms that John Deere was not matching, a manufacturer in a situation where they needed American customers and were pricing and supporting their products accordingly, which was a different situation from a manufacturer that was repositioning for the high end and allowing older customers to find their own way to the future. On the 3rd day after the Farm Bureau meeting, Vern drove to Kankakee. The Massey Ferguson dealership there was owned by a man named Ray Kowalski, who had been running it since 1971. The building was smaller than Seidel Farm Equipment and less polished in its presentation. There was no Silverado with a logo on the door in the parking lot. There was no bolo tie on the man who came out from the shop area when Vern walked in, wiping his hands on a rag, wearing a plain work shirt with a grease stain on the left sleeve that was recent enough to still be dark. Ray Kowalski shook Vern's hand the way a mechanic shakes hands, which is differently from the way a salesman shakes hands. The grip is similar, but the intention is different. A salesman's handshake is communication. A mechanic's handshake is just contact, the ordinary physical acknowledgement of one working person meeting another. Vern told him what he was thinking about. Ray listened. Then they went out to the lot and Ray showed him the MF760 and the MF860, walked him around, them opened the access panels, talked about the cylinder configuration and the separator design and the concave clearance adjustment system with the specificity of a man who had spent time inside these machines rather than just selling them. They talked for 4 hours. Not 4 hours of sales presentation, 4 hours of 2 men talking about machinery the way men talk about machinery when both of them know what they are talking about, which is to say they talked about what broke and why and how it was fixed and what needed watching and what the machine would do in conditions that were not ideal and what it would not do no matter how well you set it up. They talked about wet beans and down crops and the particular challenges of the Illinois harvest season. They talked about the difference between a machine that was built to perform in optimal conditions and a machine that was built to finish. Vern drove back to Iroquois County in the late afternoon with more information than he had left with and a clearer sense of what he was going to do, though he had not said as much to Ray Kowalski, and Ray Kowalski had not asked. There is a kind of transaction that does not require words in the moment because both parties understand what is happening and understand that the right pace for it is the pace it is already moving at. He ate supper with Opal that night. He told her he had been to Kankakee. She asked how Ray Kowalski seemed. He said solid. She said, "How much is solid going to cost us?" He said he needed to do the math. She said, "Then go do the math." He went and did the math. The math took 3 evenings at the kitchen table with the yellow notepad and the spiral notebook from the equipment shed and the farm's financial records going back 5 years. He went through what the 11 John Deere machines were worth on trade. He went through what the Massey Ferguson equipment he would need would cost new. He went through the financing terms Ray had described and what those would mean month to month against the farm's income. He went through the downtime costs from the previous 2 harvest seasons, the times the parts had been late and the fields had waited and the yield had suffered for it, and he put a dollar number on what that had cost him. He did not show Opal the numbers until he had finished. When he showed her, she sat with them for a long time without speaking, which was her way of doing the same kind of thinking he had done at the reading table in the library, slow and complete and without performance. Then she said, "The differential is $74,200. He said, "Yes." She said, "And you think this is right?" He said he thought the alternative was more expensive in the long run. She looked at the numbers again. Then she said, "I need you to tell me something. Not about the money. Tell me you understand what you are asking this farm to carry." Vern looked at her. They had been married 31 years. In 31 years, you learn that some questions are not requests for information. They are requests for the kind of honest accounting that goes beyond spreadsheets. Opal was asking him whether he had looked at this decision with his whole self and not just the part of himself that ran figures on a yellow notepad. He said, "I do understand it. I have been watching this happen for 2 years. The parts situation is not going to get better. It is going to get worse. What happened with the 6,600 this September is what is going to keep happening. And the next time it happens, it might be at the wrong moment in the wrong year with less margin to absorb it than we have right now." Opal looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "All right then." 3 words. The same 3 words she had said when he first told her he was thinking about something. But these 3 words had a different weight because they came after the numbers were on the table and she had sat with them and considered them and arrived at the same place he had arrived at. She was not deferring to him. She was agreeing with him. There is a difference, and Vern Calloway knew the difference, and it mattered. She signed where he told her to sign. The trade happened over 6 weeks in the fall of 1979. 11 John Deere machines, every one of them, traded in pieces to Ray Kowalski in Kankakee and to 2 other Massey Ferguson dealers he had located in Livingston County. 4 tractors, the 2 6600 combines, 2 planters, the cultivator, the grain cart, the field cultivator, all of it green and yellow, all of it logged in the spiral notebook on the shelf in the equipment shed, all of it carrying 30 years of mornings in its paint and its metal and the particular knowledge that lived in Vern Calloway's hands. He gave it all up. In its place came 3 MF595 tractors, 1 MF1105, 2 MF760 combines, 1 MF860 combine, a Massey planter, a hay conditioner, 3 additional pieces of support equipment, all of it red, a color that had never before appeared on the Calloway farm in any capacity other than the occasional red barn. The dollar difference, accounting for all the trades and all the new purchases, came to $74,200, which Vern financed through the farm credit bank at terms that made Opal's jaw tighten when she saw them, but which she had already agreed to and did not revisit. On the evening before the first red machine was scheduled to be delivered, Vern went out to the equipment shed after supper. He did not go to work. He went to stand in it, which was something he rarely did. The shed was a working space, not a space for standing. But that evening he walked in through the side door and he stood there in the yellow light of the overhead bulbs and he looked at what was in the shed, which was not very much because most of the John Deere equipment had already been picked up and the Massey Ferguson equipment had not yet arrived. The space was larger than it had ever been, emptier. The hooks where the 6600 header had hung were empty. The floor where the grain cart had sat was bare concrete. He stood in that empty space for a while. 30 years of green and yellow, not paint, not really. 30 years of mornings in the dark before anyone else was awake, climbing into a cab that smelled of diesel and lubricant and the particular smell of a machine that had been worked hard for years and maintained honestly. 30 years of learning what those machines would do and what they would not do and where they were reliable and where they needed watching. 30 years of a kind of knowledge that does not have a name but that lives in your hands and your body, and the specific way you hear an engine and know by the sound whether it is working the way it should or working harder than it likes. He was 61 years old. He had learned one set of machines across the better part of his adult life. He was about to start over. He stood in the empty shed, and he did not make a sound, and he did not move for a long time. Then he turned off the lights and walked back to the house. He did not tell Opal he had done this. He did not tell Mitch. He did not tell anyone. It was not the kind of thing you tell people. It was the kind of thing you do alone in the dark and carry with you going forward, not as regret, but as weight, which is different. Weight is not a reason to stop. Weight is just what carrying something honestly feels like. Word got around Iroquois County, the way word always gets around in farm country, faster than weather, slower than fire, and with more embellishment than either. By the time the first red tractor rolled down the road toward the Callaway farm in early November of 1979, half the county seemed to know about it. The information moved through the coffee shops and the grain elevator offices and the farm bureau meetings and the conversations that happened at the edge of harvested fields where neighbors stopped their pickups to talk the way rural people talk when the work is pausing for a moment. Frank Seidel heard about it on a Tuesday morning. A farmer stopped at Seidel Farm Equipment to pick up filters and mentioned it the way you mention something you know is going to land heavy with a little distance built into the delivery. A tone that says, I am informing you rather than confronting you, which in Iroquois County in 1979 was a form of courtesy. Frank's response was reported by multiple people who were present or heard it from people who were present. The accounts were consistent enough in their substance that the core of it was not in doubt. It was a short laugh, dismissive rather than amused, the laugh of a man who is not concerned about what he has just been told. And then a sentence that people in Iroquois County repeated for the better part of the next decade. Let him. When those Canadian machines fall apart in the field, he will be back. The harvest season of 1979 ended with Vern Callaway and Mitch doing what they could with borrowed equipment and delayed timelines, losing days and some yield, but getting most of the crop in before the weather closed. It was not a good harvest. It was a survivable harvest, which in a difficult year is what you aimed for. The red equipment sat in the shed through the winter, unfamiliar and new, waiting for spring and then for fall, and then for the harvest season of 1980, which was when the question that Frank Seidel had answered with a laugh would be answered by something more authoritative than a laugh. The summer of 1980 was wet, not catastrophically wet, but persistently, stubbornly wet, the kind of wet that compacts soil and lodges corn and lays soybeans down in tangles that conventional header configurations struggle to handle cleanly. By August, the standing crops across Iroquois County were a problem. The beans were down in ways that made experienced farmers look at them and run calculations about what kind of harvest losses they were going to have to absorb and which machines were capable of minimizing those losses and which were going to make them worse. Vern spent 2 days in late August and early September in the equipment shed with the operator's manual for the MF760 and with the handwritten notes Curtis had sent him from Manitoba after their phone call in the fall. Curtis had farmed wet beans in Manitoba for years. He knew what the machine could do in those conditions, and he knew precisely how to set it up to do it. The notes were specific. Cylinder speed at 900 revolutions per minute. Concave clearance, set tighter than you thought you needed, and then backed off 3 turns. Real speed relative to ground speed at a specific ratio that Curtis had worked out over years of wet harvests and which he described in the plain language of a man who had learned it by doing it wrong first. Vern read those notes 3 times, then he set the machine, He did not set it by the numbers alone. He set it the way he had always set machinery, with the numbers as a starting point and his hands and ears as the finishing point, making small adjustments and listening to what the machine said in response, the way you tune an instrument by sound rather than by a chart on the wall. He ran the header through air and listened to the cylinder. He ran it through a small section of standing beans and listened to the separation. He adjusted. He listened again. He kept adjusting until the machine sounded like what he had come to recognize in Curtis's notes and in his own early runs, with the equipment that fall as the sound of the MF760 working as it was designed to work. When he was finished, the machine was not what it had been 2 days before. It was something he understood, not the way he had understood the 6600 after 12 years. That kind of understanding takes time that cannot be shortened, but enough to go to work. The harvest began rolling across Iroquois County in the third week of September. The combines went out and almost immediately the trouble started. Two of Frank Seidel's customers' men who had been running newer John Deere equipment and who had not had the same parts availability problems that Vern had experienced with the 6600 went down within the first 4 days of harvest. One was a separator bearing failure on a 7700 that required a part on a 14-day back order. One was a feeder house chain issue on an 8820 that Frank's shop could diagnose but could not fix for 9 days because the specific chain was not in stock. Between those two machines, approximately 1,100 acres of soybeans stood in the field while the weather held its breath. On the 5th day of harvest, Vern Calloway walked from the house to the equipment shed at 5:30 in the morning. The dew was still heavy. The beans in the fields around the farmstead were down and tangled, laying in the matted way that wet your soybeans lay, the kind of condition that could stall a machine with insufficient pickup reel clearance or inadequate threshing cylinder adjustment. Vern had set the machine for exactly this. He had spent 2 days making sure of it. He climbed into the cab of the MF760. He started the engine. He listened to it for a moment, the way he always listened to equipment before he put it to work. Reading the sounds, the way you read the weather, looking for anything that needed attention before it became something worse. The engine sounded the way it had been sounding. Good, steady, working. He pulled out of the shed and drove to the field as the sun came up orange and enormous over the flat eastern horizon, the way the Illinois sun comes up in September, coloring the fog pink and then gold, and for a moment the whole landscape was the color of the grain he was about to harvest. He entered the field. The machine went into the down beans and it did not stop. That is the simplest way to say what happened, and it is also the most accurate. The MF760 entered a field of wet, tangled lodge soybeans in conditions that had already stopped or slowed machines across Iroquois County, and it kept moving. The cylinder ran at 900 revolutions per minute, the way Curtis had described, and the beans came through the machine and separated cleanly and fell into the grain tank while the stalks and the chaff went out the back in the even stream that means a machine is processing correctly. The grain tank filled steadily. The loss at the rear of the machine was minimal. The machine did not stop. At noon, Mitch brought a sandwich and a thermos of coffee out to the field on the four-wheeler, the way he had been doing for his father since he was old enough to drive the four-wheeler. He sat on the machine step while Vern ate the two of them, looking out over the field at the clean swath of harvested ground and the still standing beans ahead. Mitch asked, "How is she running?" How? Vern chewed, swallowed, looked at the grain tank gauge, looked at the field ahead, said like she means it. Mitch nodded. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Then Vern screwed the lid back on the thermos and handed it back, and Mitch rode the four-wheeler back to the farmstead, and Vern put the machine back in gear and kept going. By sundown, Vern Calloway had harvested 180 acres. Gene Halstead, his neighbor to the west, had managed 90 acres that day with one John Deere 600 running and one down, waiting for a part that was, according to the Seidel dealership, 8 to 12 days out. The morning of the second day, a farmer named Dwight Overby stopped his pickup truck at the edge of Vern's field and watched. Dwight Overby was not a man who moved quickly. He had farmed in Iroquois County for 30 years, had run John Deere equipment for all of those 30 years, and was precisely the kind of man who does not make changes to the things that have been working, because he has seen enough changes that didn't need to be made to be cautious about the ones that might. He was cautious as a matter of character, not as a matter of fear. There is a difference, and in farming it matters. He stood at the edge of the field for 20 minutes. He watched the red machine moving through the down beans. He watched the clean line it left behind the even harvested ground and the minimal loss visible at the rear of the machine. He watched the uninterrupted motion. No stops, no adjustments made in a hurry, no pauses to unclog a header or check a separator. Just the machine and the crop, and the particular quiet confidence that a well-set machine working in the conditions it was set for has a quality that experienced equipment operators can identify across a field without being close enough to hear the cylinder. Dwight Overby stood at the fence line for 20 minutes. Then he got back in his pickup and drove to the nearest phone, which was at the grain elevator in Watseka, and called Ray Kowalski at the Kankakee dealership. He was not the last call Ray received that week from Iroquois County. By the end of that first full week of harvest, Ray Kowalski had received 11 calls from farmers in Iroquois County. 11 calls from a county that had been solidly green for 30 years, from men who had run John Deere their entire farming lives and who had not expected to be making this call and were making it anyway, because they had seen something or heard something from someone who had seen something, and the questions that had been raised were not going away. The questions were specific and practical, the questions that farmers ask rather than the questions that are asked for other reasons. They wanted to know about the parts availability program. They wanted to know about the transition process. They wanted to know what the machines would do in wet beans. They wanted to know what Ray Kowalski was and was not willing to say about the comparison with what they had been running. Ray answered what he could answer and was straightforward about what he could not, which was the right approach in which Vern Calloway could have told anyone who asked that it was going to be Ray Kowalski's approach, because 4 hours in, that Kankakee dealership had told him exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. The Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1980 was standing room only. 60 people, maybe 70, crowded into the VFW hall on Grant Street. The nominal agenda was tile drainage grants and ASCS program updates. Nobody in the room was primarily there for the tile drainage grants or the ASCS program updates. Frank Seidel arrived as he always arrived, working the room bolo tie, Silverado keys in his jacket pocket, the practiced handshake dispensed at intervals. But the room that November was different from the room he was used to. Conversation stopped a half second too late when he approached. The laughter that came in response to his comments came a half beat behind where it should have come. The temperature of the space was not what he expected it to be, and he could feel that it was not. And the smile he wore did not quite extend to his eyes the way it had extended in previous Novembers. Vern Calloway sat in the same chair he had sat in the year before, near the back, quiet, waiting. Someone asked him to give a harvest report. It was Dwight Overby, the cautious man who had stood at the field's edge for 20 minutes the previous month and had not forgotten what he saw. He asked it the way you ask a question when you already know the answer is going to matter. Vern gave numbers. He gave them the way he always gave information, flatly, without theater, without the smile that makes cruelty a courtesy or the swagger that turns a fact into a performance. He said, 680 acres harvested. Average yield 42.3 bushels per acre against a county average for the acres that got harvested clean of 38.9. 0 machine downtime, 0 parts delays. 1 minor belt adjustment on day 4 completed in 38 minutes using parts from the on-hand kit Ray Kowalski had recommended he carry. Then he sat back down. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Frank Seidel said something. The accounts vary on what exactly. Some people remember him questioning the yield numbers. Some people remember him bringing up long-term reliability and resale value. Some people remember him talking about the difference between one good season and a long-term track record. Whatever he said, it landed in that silence, the way a stone lands in still water, and the ripples went in a direction he had not intended. Roy Fenner, who had been sitting on the left side of the room in the third row, turned to look at Frank Seidel across the VFW hall. Roy was not a dramatic man. He was a farmer. He had lost 9 days of harvest that year, waiting for a part that Seidel Farm Equipment could not get him in time, 9 days during which 300 acres of beans had stood in a field while the weather did what it wanted to do, regardless of what Roy Fenner needed it to do. Roy said, "Frank, quietly, the way you say something when you do not need to raise your voice to be heard. I lost 9 days this harvest waiting on a part you could not get me. I need you to explain to me why I should feel good about that." Nobody laughed. Frank Seidel left early that night. Vern Calloway drove home in the dark on Route 24, the same road he had driven home on after every Farm Bureau meeting for 20 years, the same flat landscape on either side, the same grain elevator visible against the sky as he came into Watseka from the east. The harvest was in. The beans were in the bins. The numbers were what the numbers were. The equipment shed light was on when he pulled into the yard. He sat in the truck for a moment in the gravel drive and looked at it, the yellow light through the open door of the shed, the shapes of the red machines visible inside. Then he went in. The change did not happen overnight. Real things rarely do. Real things move the way water moves through limestone slowly and without announcement, following the path of least resistance until the path becomes a channel and the channel becomes something you can no longer ignore. What happened in Iroquois County after the harvest of 1980 happened that way, in the patient, unhurried manner of a thing that has found its time and does not need to hurry because the direction is already established. By the spring of 1981, 6 farms in Iroquois County had either fully converted to Massey Ferguson equipment or had added Massey machines to their operations. 6 farms in a county that had been as solidly green as any county in Illinois for 30 years. 6 farms where red tractors now sat beside fields that had been planted and harvested with green machines since before some of the men driving them were born. Ray Kowalski's dealership in Kankakee had received enough calls from Iroquois County in the months following the 1980 harvest that he had added a second service technician specifically to handle the volume. By the end of 1981, he had added a third. The calls kept coming. He said later that he had never advertised in Iroquois County. Not once. He said the advertising had been done for him by a 1980 harvest season in a wet year in a county where some machines had finished and some had not, and by the 11 calls he had received in 1 week from farmers who had stood at fence lines and watched a red combine move through down beans and had not looked away. Vern Calloway did not take credit for any of this. When people asked him about it, when neighbors stopped him at the grain elevator or the hardware store to talk about what he had done and what it had started, he said the same thing he always said, which was that he had looked at a problem and followed it to where it pointed. And the pointing had been clear enough. He did not say it with false modesty. He said it with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who genuinely did not see what he had done as remarkable, because to him it had not been remarkable. It had been necessary. The distinction was important to him. Opal understood this about him. She had understood it for 31 years. She kept the books, and she watched the numbers And when the numbers from the 1980 harvest season went into the ledger beside the numbers from the 1979 season and the 1978 season, the comparison spoke in the plainest possible language. The downtime cost from the previous 3 years under the John Deere equipment had been real and substantial. The downtime cost from the first full season under the Massey Ferguson equipment had been a belt adjustment and 38 minutes. The ledger did not have an opinion about this. It just had numbers. Now let me tell you about Frank Seidel in the months after that November Farm Bureau meeting, because what Frank Seidel did next is the part of the story that people in Iroquois County argued about for years, and the arguing was worth something, because what he did was the kind of thing that is worth arguing about. Frank Seidel, when he understood what was happening, made a decision. He could not undo the decisions that had been made. He could not go back and stock the parts that had been back-ordered during harvest seasons when men like Vern Calloway and Roy Fenner had needed them. He could not unsay the thing he had said about antiques in the 1970s. He could not unlaugh the laugh he had laughed when he heard the first red tractor was rolling onto the Calloway farm. Those things were done and their effects were already in motion. What he could do, or what he believed he could do, was manage the damage. He could identify the farmers who had left and make clear to those who remained that staying was the better choice. He could create sufficient friction for the defectors, as he thought of them, that their transition became more difficult, that their questions went unanswered, and their remaining business was slow walked, and their experience of dealing with him was uncomfortable enough that some of them might reconsider. He could not legally refuse to sell to members of the public. In a small county where everyone knew everyone and everyone talked to everyone, an outright refusal would have been its own kind of catastrophe. So he found the softer forms of the same message: convenient delays, parts that were technically in stock but needed to be located, phone calls not returned until the urgency had passed, a tone at the counter not rude exactly but weighted, carrying a quality of unwelcome that experienced people could read without being told. He did this for farmers who still ran John Deere equipment but had also added a Massey machine. He did it for farmers who had converted entirely. He did it in the most minimal form for farmers who had simply been present at the November meeting and had not said the right things about what they had witnessed. Farmers talk. This is not a complicated observation, but it is a foundational one if you want to understand what happened to Seidel farm equipment over the 4 years that followed that November meeting. Farmers talk the way all close communities talk, with specificity and memory, and the particular attention to detail that comes from lives where details matter and mistakes are expensive. They do not forget who was generous to them in a difficult moment, and they do not forget who was not. They do not forget who had the parts when they needed them, and they do not forget who found a reason to make them wait. The story of Frank Seidel's convenient delays moved through the coffee shops and the grain elevator offices of Iroquois County, the way cold moves through a drafty barn without announcement, finding every crack. A farmer who had asked for a part and waited 3 days for something that should have taken 3 hours told another farmer. That farmer told 2 more. The stories accumulated the way accounts accumulate when they are consistent with each other, each one reinforcing the pattern that the others had described, until the pattern was not a rumor, but a reputation. By 1983, farmers who had done business with Seidel Farm equipment for a decade were finding reasons to drive to dealerships in other counties. Not because Seidel could not serve them, because they had heard enough to decide they preferred not to be served by him. The business Seidel lost in those years was not lost in a single dramatic event. It was lost the way most businesses lost, quietly and gradually, and through the compounding of small decisions whose effects are not visible until the total is undeniable. Frank did not see it clearly until it was already well advanced. By the time he understood what was happening, the customer base he had spent 11 years building had contracted in ways that could not be reversed through effort or charm or the practiced handshake dispensed at Farm Bureau meetings. The room that had belonged to him did not belong to him anymore. The energy had gone somewhere else. In 1985, the agricultural crisis that had been a rumor on the wind in 1979 was no longer a rumor. It was the dominant fact of farming life in the Midwest, and it was brutal in a way that statistics cannot fully convey and that people who did not live through it cannot fully imagine. Interest rates had climbed to 20%. Land values had dropped by 30, 40, 50% in some counties. The farmers who had borrowed against land values that no longer existed were underwater in ways that prudent management could not fix, because the problem was not management, it was math. The USDA counted more than 300,000 farm failures between 1981 and 1987. The foreclosure auctions in Iroquois County happened on schedule one after another, and neighbors attended them in the silence of people who know they are witnessing something that should not be witnessed, but that must be witnessed, because to look away would be a different kind of failure. Men who had farmed well and carefully and for decades stood in fields they had mortgaged and watched those fields go to someone else. And there was no adequate language for what that was. Seidel Farm Equipment's customer base, already weakened by the years of slow erosion that Frank's decisions had produced, contracted further under the weight of the crisis. Farmers who might have bought new equipment did not buy new equipment. Farmers who were losing their land were not buying anything at all. By 1985, the dealership was running at a fraction of the volume Frank had built it to handle, and the fraction was shrinking. Frank Seidel sold the dealership in 1987 to a regional chain that rebranded it and restructured the operation entirely. The people who had worked there kept their jobs through the transition. But the business itself, the thing Frank had built and considered his own and described to anyone who listened as the premier equipment operation in Iroquois and Ford counties combined, was gone. The name on the sign changed. The logo on the truck changed. The man in the pressed Wranglers and the bolo tie was no longer there when you walked in. In the fall of 1987, Ray Kowalski opened a satellite service location in Watska. He found a building available for lease on the south side of town. It was approximately 4 blocks from where Seidel Farm Equipment had stood. He did not choose the location because of the proximity. He chose it because it had adequate space for a service bay and reasonable rent, and because Watseka was where his Iroquois County customers were, and by 1987, he had enough Iroquois County customers to make a permanent presence there worth maintaining. Nobody arranged this. It was simply where the demand was and where the supply went to meet it. But the 4 blocks were noted, and the noting was done quietly and in the particular tone that Iroquois County farmers used when they described events that had arranged themselves with a justice they had not engineered but could recognize and appreciate. Now let me tell you about the Callaway farm through the 1980s, because the story of what Vern Callaway did in 1979 is not a story about a man who made a good decision and avoided all consequences. The farm crisis of that decade did not spare the careful. It did not discriminate between the farmers who had made good decisions and the farmers who had made poor ones. It was larger than individual decisions. It came down on everyone. Vern and Opal felt it. The interest rates on the financing they had taken for the equipment trade pressed against the farm's margin in years when margins were already thin. The land values that had been one form of security became a less reliable form of security as values dropped. There were years in the mid-1980s when Opal's ledgers showed results that required her to look at the numbers several times before she accepted what they were saying. And what they were saying was that the farm was surviving, but that surviving was the correct word to use, and comfort was not. What the equipment decision had done, and what Vern's accountant said clearly to people for years afterward, was reduce the farm's per acre machinery costs in ways that provided exactly the margin of cushion that sometimes made the difference between surviving and not. Lower downtime meant more acres harvested in the optimal window, which meant better yields, which meant better income from the same ground. Lower parts costs meant less cash leaving the operation in the years when cash was the substance everything else depended on. A cost structure that was more transparent and more predictable meant Opal's planning was more accurate, and accurate planning in a difficult decade meant fewer surprises at the wrong moment. These were not dramatic things. They did not make headlines. They were the small, unglamorous arithmetic of a farm that stayed alive in a decade when many farms did not, and the arithmetic had a contribution from a yellow notepad and a 3-hour afternoon at the public library, and a 4-hour conversation in a Kankakee equipment dealership. And that contribution was real, even if it could not be isolated in any single number. Vern never ran a John Deere machine again. Not from bitterness. He was not a bitter man. He did not spend his subsequent years making an argument about what he had done or positioning himself as a man who had seen what others had not. When people asked, he answered. When they did not ask, he said nothing. The decision had been made, and the consequences of the decision had been what they were, and that was sufficient. He did not need the story to be a particular shape. Mitch Callaway bought 160 additional acres in 1983 when a neighbor retired and was willing to sell. The operation grew. The red machines worked the additional ground the way they had worked the original ground reliably and without the particular anxiety that comes from wondering what is going to break next and how long it will take to fix it. Mitch had come into the Massey Ferguson equipment without the weight of 30 years of green paint behind him, and it showed. He approached it with the practical attention of a young farmer learning his machines, rather than the complicated loyalty of a man who had given up one set of them for another. He was his father's son in the ways that mattered. He watched, he listened, he maintained the spiral notebook on the shelf in the equipment shed with the same obsessive care that Vern had brought to the original one. Different notebook, same handwriting style, same precision. He went out after difficult harvests and looked at what the machines had done and what they had not done and adjusted accordingly. He learned by doing, and he retained what he learned. By the late 1980s, when the worst of the crisis was beginning to pass for the farms that had survived it, the Callaway operation was positioned to move forward in a way that some of their neighbors were not. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but positioned. Mitch eventually ran a mixed fleet, some red machines, some other colors. The decisions he made about what to buy and what to run were made on merit, on the specific cost and reliability and parts availability characteristics of the equipment being considered. At the moment, it was being considered with the pragmatism of a man who had been raised to understand that loyalty to a color was not the same thing as loyalty to a principle, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between a sentimental decision and a good one. His father had taught him that. Not in a classroom, not in a speech, in the way Vern Callaway taught everything, which was by doing it in front of him and letting him watch. Vern Callaway died in July of 1994. He was 76 years old. The illness was short, and the end was what the end is, which is to say it was not a surprise, and it was still a grief, the specific grief of losing someone who had been the fixed point around which a considerable number of other things had organized themselves for a very long time. Opal was with him. Mitch was with him. The summer was hot in the way that Illinois Julys are hot, the kind of heat that sits on the flatland and does not move. And the crops in the fields around the Callaway farmstead were doing what crops do in July in good years, which is growing with the focused single-mindedness of things that know exactly what they are for. The service was held at the Methodist Church in Watseka. More than 200 people came. Most of them were farmers. You could tell by the hands, the particular color and texture of hands that have worked outdoors in all weather for decades, and by the slightly formal discomfort of men who are wearing their good clothes on a weekday and are aware of it. They filled the church and stood in the vestibule when the pews were full and listened to the service with the quiet attention of people who understood what was being marked. Mitch spoke. He talked about his father, the way a son talks about a man he has watched work for his entire conscious life and come to understand only gradually, the understanding arriving not all at once but in pieces over years, each piece arriving when you were ready for it and not before. He talked about the spiral notebook. He talked about the way his father had maintained machinery, the obsessive precision of it, the logs going back 15 years, the oil change dates, and the belt replacement schedules, and the bearing inspections carried out by feel and by memory as much as by any instrument. He talked about the way his father moved through the farm early in the morning before anyone else was awake, checking things, noticing things, carrying his knowledge of the operation in a way that made it invisible because it was so completely incorporated into how he moved and what he saw. He said, "My father understood that the land is honest." He said it a few times over the years, not as a lesson, just as a fact he had arrived at and wanted to share when it seemed relevant. The land rewards results, not intentions, not brand loyalty, not the practiced handshake of the man who sold you the equipment. Results. Ray Kowalski drove up from Kankakee for the service. He sat in the back of the church, which was where he had decided to sit because he was not sure of his place among the people who had known Vern Calloway as a neighbor and a friend and a family member, and the back felt right. He had known Vern Calloway as a customer who had become something else over 15 years. Not a friend exactly in the way that the word is ordinarily used, but something that did not have a more precise name. The kind of relationship that forms between two men who respect each other's competence and honesty, and who have been in each other's presence enough times across enough years that the relationship has its own weight. He sat in the back and listened to Mitch speak and nodded at the things Mitch said that were recognizable to him from his own experience of the man being described. After the service, when people had moved out of the church into the hot July air of the parking lot and the adjacent lawn, the gathering had the quality that gatherings have when they are both a grief and a recognition. When the people present understand they are there not only to mark a loss, but to confirm for each other that the thing being lost was real and was valuable and had mattered in ways that outlasted the person who carried it. People talked to Mitch. They told him things about his father that Mitch already knew, and things about his father that Mitch did not know, because people always know things about someone that the person's own family does not know, things that were said in passing or witnessed in a particular moment that did not reach the family, but that are part of the complete picture of who someone was. A man named Ted Burwell, who had farmed the half section west of the Calloway property for 30 years, and who had been one of the farmers at the November Farm Bureau meeting in 1980 when Vern had given his harvest numbers without theater or performance, came up to Mitch and stood with him for a while. He said, "Your father stood up at that Farm Bureau meeting and gave numbers, just numbers. He did not try to make anyone feel foolish for what they had been running. He did not tell anyone what they should do. He just said what had happened the way he always said things, and then he sat back down." I have been to a lot of Farm Bureau meetings in 30 years, and I have seen a lot of men stand up and talk. I have seen men make arguments and make speeches and make performances. I do not remember most of them. I remember your father sitting back down. Mitch listened to this. He said that was him, yes. Someone else, a younger farmer who had not been there in 1979 or 1980 and knew the story only from what he had heard, asked Mitch what he thought his father's greatest quality was. It was a genuine question asked with the directness of someone who wanted a genuine answer, and understood that the moment called for one. Mitch thought about it. The pause was not long in duration, but it was complete in quality. The kind of pause that means the person pausing is actually thinking rather than reaching for the answer they prepared. It was the kind of pause his father would have recognized, because his father had made that same kind of pause his whole life, and because Mitch had been watching it long enough that he had incorporated it without knowing he had. Then he said he did not let other people's confidence substitute for his own thinking. He said it simply and without elaboration, the way his father would have said it. The people standing nearby heard it. Some of them nodded. Some of them were quiet in the way people are quiet when something has been said that takes a moment to absorb. Then Mitch said he was going to get a piece of Opal's pie, because there was pie, and because his father would have wanted him to eat something. He walked toward the table where the food was leaving the people who had been listening to stand with what he had said. Today, Mitch Callaway farms 840 acres. The number grows. He runs a mixed fleet, some red, some other colors, decisions made on the specific merits of specific equipment in the context of what the operation needs at the moment the decision is required. He maintains a spiral notebook on the shelf above the workbench in the equipment shed. Different notebook, same handwriting style, same precision. The oil change dates and the belt replacement schedules and the bearing inspections, all of it logged, the way his father logged it, with the care that comes from understanding that the thing you are tracking is not just a number, but a relationship with the ground and the machines and the seasons that does not tolerate carelessness. He learned this from Vern Callaway, not in a classroom, not in a speech, but in the way farmers learn the things that last, which is by working alongside someone who already knows them and paying attention to what they pay attention to and keeping that attention long enough that it becomes your own. Somewhere in Iroquois County, in a county seat with a grain elevator that still rises above the rooftops, the way a cathedral rises above a village, the fields are flat in the way they have always been flat, biblically flat. Flat in a way that makes the curvature of the earth a personal experience rather than a scientific concept. In September, the standing crops are the color of everything that has grown up from that ground across the years, and everything that will grow up from it in the years that have not yet arrived. Among the combines that move through those fields on harvest days, there are machines that are not the color they would have been if a different man had sat in the public library on a Wednesday afternoon in September of 1979. There are machines running on farms that were changed by watching one red combine move through down beans in a wet year without stopping. There are machines that exist on those farms because Dwight Overby stood at a fence line for 20 minutes and because Roy Fenner stood up in a VFW hall and asked a question that nobody laughed at. All of it began with a 61-year-old man climbing down from a dead combine, picking up his hat, putting it back on his head, and walking 2 miles home to figure out what to do next. He figured it out. The land rewards results. Vern Callaway understood that the way he understood everything that mattered on that farm, not as a philosophy, not as a principle to be argued, but as a fact that showed up in the ledger every season, honest and unsparing. The way the land itself is honest and unsparing with the people who are willing to read it straight. He had read it straight for 61 years. He had asked the right questions and followed them to the right answers and done the work that the answers required. Even when the work meant standing alone in an empty equipment shed in the dark. With 30 years of green and yellow going out of the world and something unfamiliar coming in. He had done it the only way such things can be done, which is by being more honest about what was true than he was loyal to what was familiar. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.